Hi, my name is Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and I am a Rabbanit for the young women after Shirut Leumi here in Migdal Oz. And I wanted to share a thought on this coming week's parasha. The end of Parashat Noach presents the journey of Terach, of Abraham's father, as he journeys from Ur Kasdim towards Eretz Canaan. And the psukim say as follows: Vayichi Terach 70 shana, vayoled et Avraham et Nachor ve'et Haran. Terach lives 70, well, he is 70 years old when he gives birth to his children. And the psukim continue, I'm skipping a few. Vayikach Terach et Avraham beno, ve'et Lot beno, Haran ben beno, ve'et Sarai kalato, ויצאו איתם מאור כסדים ללכת ארצה כנען, ויבואו עד חרן וישבו שם. Psukim detail a journey that Terach undergoes, where he takes his family and he leaves from Ur Kasdim and he goes towards Eretz Canaan. But instead of reaching Eretz Canaan, he stops. He stops at Haran and he never ends up leaving. And then we're told at the end of that section, ויהי ימי תרח 5 שנים ו200 שנה, וימות תרח בחרן. How old was Terach when he dies? He is 250 years old. That section ends, and then we read continually in Parashat Lecha about Hashem's commandment to Avraham to journey to Eretz Canaan. And when we open up the next psukim, it's as if we're reading about an entirely different journey altogether. ויאמר אדוני על אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך. And there he's told to leave, and the psukim that we know and are familiar with. The question becomes, when we start doing the math and thinking a little bit deeper about the psukim, what exactly is going on here? Because it turns out that these journeys are more intimately connected than the psukim initially lead us to believe. If you do the math, Avraham is born when Terach is about 70 years old. And he himself is 75 when he journeys to Eretz Canaan, which makes his father 145. If his father lived 250 years, then Terach will still be alive for a long time after Avraham goes towards Eretz Canaan. Question that we're familiar with from Rashi and other Parshanim and other commentators. Avraham goes towards Canaan when Terach is still alive, living in Haran. But the questions multiply as we think further. Avraham is told to leave his father's household, his birthplace, which seems to be Ur Kasdim. It doesn't seem to be Haran. The psukim point to the fact that while he physically leaves Haran, it seems that the commandment itself to actually take on this journey was told to him in Ur Kasdim. And that impression is increased when we read later on in Sefer Bereshit, in Perek Yudaled in chapter 14, where in fact, when God commands him regarding the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant of the pieces, he speaks about him leaving initially and commanded in Ur Kasdim. And so we're starting to try and figure out what's the place of Ur Kasdim, of Haran, of Terach and Avraham leaving. And when we think about it, we start to come to the conclusion that Avraham was likely commanded when he was living in Ur Kasdim, and that Terach, his father, is inspired by the commandment that God gives him. How the Torah presents it is that Terach journeys, he doesn't make it, he stops and stays there and eventually dies. And then Avraham, after that, starts his own journey. But when we think about the facts, it actually seems to be that the journeys are much more intertwined. Avraham is commanded way back when they were still living in Ur Kasdim. And it could be, although the psukim don't tell us, that that's why Terach initially gets up and moves. He's inspired by the mission that God gives Avraham. But what happens? He doesn't make it all the way. He stops in Haran. And Avraham, propelled by the commandment that God gives him, has to move forward. That's the nature of being commanded by God. He can't just stay there because it was comfortable, because life was good there. He has to keep moving forward. And then he continues on to the journey we're all familiar with that leads into the rest of Sefer Bereshit. But the bigger question, I think, is why does the Torah present the story as such, as if Terach journeys on his own and Avram has his own separate journey, when in reality, how the events likely unfolded were that they were a joint journey, the father and son separated, and then Abraham continues on after that on his own while his father remains in Haran. And here, I think, is where we get to a deeper point about the journeying that we do as parents and as children. We all in some way, and here's why I think the Torah wants to first present Terach as if his journey is independent from Avram's, is that we all in some way continue on the journeys of our parents. They start, whether it's in their personality traits or the decisions they make in life or physical journeys they had to make perhaps as refugees, people moving to new countries. But ultimately, we will continue those journeys a step further. The biggest difference, I think, according to the Torah, is that while Terach was just inspired by the religious mission he heard his son receiving, he wasn't himself propelled by that divine commandment. So he could just stop and live his life wherever was most comfortable. But Avram had to keep going. That's the nature of life when you live according to God's commandment, is that there is always going to be that space between what is comfortable and what you'd like to do and what you have to do, because that's what God tells you. But I think that there's something here that's being reflected about the nature of relationships between parents and children, which is that sometimes parents are inspired by their own children, and that can also start or continue them on their journeys. But what I think the Torah is presenting as primal is the fact that parents begin something, but they can't always finish it. And that's where our children come in a comforting way, both for the parent and for the child. That children are here to continue on the work that we've started, that we can't possibly ever finish in our lifetime. And that as children, it's incumbent upon us to realize what we have received from our parents, what we've received from the generations before us. I think it also helps us have insight on our journey in this world, and to see where we eventually continue to go forward, where we're able to blossom and propel far beyond where our parents ever may have envisioned themselves being. And so I think that when I look at Abraham, I think the Torah wants us to see him as a continuation of Terach. He was a maverick, he was an iconoclast, he was somebody who brought something completely new to the world, but not really. Even Abraham, having been so unique and the father of all of Yahadut, that even he was continuing on a journey that his father started in even some small way. If I could just finish and say that my father passed away 5 years ago, this Shabbat. He passed away on Friday night of Shabbat Lecha. And every year when this Shabbat comes and I commemorate along with my family his yard site, I always think about this idea because of all the children, I in many ways notice how I'm very similar to my father. And I think that as a parent and as a person walking through this world, it gives me comfort to know how similar I am to him in those ways, and also gives me inspiration to keep moving forward, where I see how I have been able to add newer dimensions to those journeys that he himself began.